This might be a little different than your typical scary camping story. This didn't happen while I was alone, and it didn't happen way out in the wilderness either. A bunch of friends of mine rented a cabin for a couple of weeks during the summer. Basically, it was just going to be a 2-week party with lots of beer and weed and the like. Also, I want to point out that our cabin was not way out into the woods. It was in a very recreational area in which many cabins were available for rent. We could actually see several other cabins from our own, so my friends and I built a fire every night. We sat around it and did camp stuff. You know, traded around ghost stories and stuff. My friend Justin got himself really drunk and revealed that he had brought some fireworks with him. He lit them in the fire. It was pretty cool. Not long after the fireworks went off, though, we were interrupted by a pretty big guy showing up. He came right up to the fire and didn't even say hi or introduce himself. He immediately just started yelling at us about the fireworks. Apparently, he had been sleeping nearby, and the noise had just woken him up. We tried apologizing to the guy, but he wouldn't even let us get a word in. He just kept talking over us about how inconsiderate we were. Justin kept trying to interject and apologize. The guy still wouldn't listen though, so Justin took a step towards the guy with his hands held out, indicating he meant no harm. That's when the guy turned to Justin and told him that if he took another step towards him, the man would kill him right then and there. That's when I'd had enough. I was nowhere near as big as this guy was, but I had a very loud voice and a very nasty temper. I told the guy to shut the hell up now. All we were doing was trying to apologize to him, and he wasn't letting us get a single word in. That's when he started moving towards me specifically. All 5 of my friends got up, and he realized he wasn't as tough as he thought he was. Clearly, he wouldn't be able to get into a fight with 6 people. Throwing around every swear word I'd ever heard, plus a few new ones, the guy stomped out not long after. We all went inside, and my friends all went to bed before I did. I was still a bit worked up over the incident, and I decided to sit in the living room and read for a while to calm down. I'm a smoker, and even though it wasn't a non-smoking cabin, I always tried to smoke outside anyway. I went out and sat on the swing outside to smoke. That was when I noticed that our fire wasn't all the way out yet. I went over to stamp it out, so it didn't spread somehow during the night and start an accidental forest fire. As I was stamping out the fire though, I heard some noises coming from behind me. I turned just in time for a fist to slam me in the side of the face. I knew instantly it was the guy from earlier. He pounced on top of me and pulled out a knife. He held it up to my throat and started talking to me, threatening me under his breath. I couldn't say I remembered everything he was saying to me, but the gist of it was him taunting me about how it wasn't easy for me to act like a man without my friends around. He also told me not to call for them, or else. I wasn't sure what to do in that moment, but I was obviously really scared. I thought the guy was just going to kill me here in the night, but he eventually did take the knife away from my throat. He kept pressing his knee into my back though, so I couldn't get up. I felt the guy grab my hand. He pulled it up and grabbed onto my fingers. I asked him what he was going to do to me, and he told me he was going to give me something to remember him by. He took the 4 fingers of my left hand and bent them back as far as he could. I screamed and felt them all snap. He then told me if I told anyone what happened there, I could look forward to the knife next time. He then left. Well, of course, I was going to tell someone. I got my friends up. Jason was pissed. He grabbed his compound hunting bow, and he was determined to go and kill the guy. I talked him down from it, and told him we should just call the cops instead. I mentioned we weren't even that far out from civilization anyway. We got a police officer to come quickly, and an ambulance as well. The dumbass got arrested, so I guess that's a happy ending at least. I was able to stay at the cabin for the rest of the vacation without having to worry about him coming after me, but all 4 fingers on my left hand were broken, and that was pretty agonizing. So yeah. This is a sort of weird story from when I was in junior high school. There was this odd guy in my class named Tim. I would have felt quite bad calling him odd while we were growing up, but considering the circumstances of what happened since, I have no problems with it at all. He was one of those students who was quiet. He never spoke in class at all. In fact, even if the teacher called on him to do something, he would never do it. I can't even really remember hearing his voice, or seeing him hang out with anyone, or really doing anything at all. Of course, by the time junior high school came around, students were no longer exchanging Valentine cards with the entire class. I guess that may be why this became such a problem. I still gave out several such cards just because I found it to be a very friendly thing to do, and for some reason that year, I decided to give Tim a Valentine's card as well. I actually didn't sign it though, as we often did with cards at the school. I simply slipped it in through a hole in his locker door. I made sure nobody was around to see me do it either. Somehow though, he seemed to know immediately it was me. I don't know how, but after that he became even stranger than he had been. Our classroom didn't have rows of desks. It was more like several tables placed in a big square in the room. Our teacher felt this fostered discussion. Tim sat down across from me, and he would just stare at me non-stop all day long. I did my best not to make eye contact with him, but he never broke it with me. Lunchtime at school, it was a bit like a combination of lunch and recess. We'd eat, and basically everyone would hang out in the schoolyard. I'd walk around with my best friends, but I noticed that Tim began to sneakily follow us around during the lunch period. He would always remain far enough behind me that I almost wouldn't be able to notice him. He probably couldn't hear anything we were talking about even, but he would still keep following us nonetheless. You can imagine that this all made me think twice about giving him that pity card. I thought I had been doing something nice, but it ended up making my time at school very unpleasant. Even though I actually enjoyed going to school, I now found myself dreading it every day. You can only stand having someone blatantly following you around for so long before it becomes way too much to bear. My friend suggested I just go and talk to the teacher or the principal or something, but I didn't really see how I could do that. Other than watching me all the time, he really wasn't doing anything wrong, just something a bit creepy, unsure of what to do, and not wanting to actually confront Tim directly. I decided to go ahead and write him a note and leave it in his locker like I did with the card. I explained that I really only gave it to him out of pity, and I was getting very uncomfortable with all the attention and following me around. At first, that seemed to have the intended effect that I wanted. Tim stopped staring at me right after the lunch period that day. I felt relieved. That is, I felt relieved until it was time to go home from school, when I opened my locker and found someone had shoved some ripped-up paper through the slots in the locker door. Upon closer inspection, it was clearly the Valentine's card that had originally caused all these problems. Afterwards, the attention from Tim got much worse. He would still continue to look at me, but now there was a malice in his eyes. He wouldn't follow my friends and I around the schoolyard during lunch, but instead he would now hide behind things and watch us as we walked around. I began to be a bit afraid of him and wondered if he would do something to me. About a week after things changed like this, Tim was suddenly absent from school. I had the first relaxing day there in weeks. I was almost upset to see the school day end. When I went to my locker though, I was a bit surprised to see that it was damaged. Someone had broken the lock on it. I approached with caution. I probably should have went and gotten an adult, but I didn't, as I was filled with both curiosity and fright. As I approached it, I put my hand on the door, half expecting to see Tim inside my locker either about to attack me, or maybe he'd killed himself in my locker or something. I wasn't really sure what I was going to find. I opened up the locker door and immediately screamed. There were 5 snakes in my locker. Instinctively, I slammed the door closed and ran right to the principal's office. I explained everything that had been happening with Tim and that I felt it must have been him who put the snakes in there. The school actually got in touch with Tim's parents, and they didn't seem all too surprised. I'm not absolutely sure what happened to Tim after, but I didn't really see him at school or ever again, and I really didn't mind too much. Okay, so for me to tell this story, I have to admit that I've done my fair share of finding guys on the internet to date. I've never been very good at introducing myself to people, so it was the easiest way for me to meet guys. Of course, it wasn't generally that good. I found guys often lied about their age, and there were lots of guys who'd send pictures of themselves that were clearly not them, or from like 10 years earlier or something. Probably the worst date I had ever been on, though, was with a guy who was actually really good looking. His name was Todd, and he was attractive, very much so, but he was weird as well. I was under the impression that he really wasn't interested in me at all. He really didn't talk much either. He picked me up in his car, and I had to carry the entire conversation. We went to a restaurant, and he barely said a single word the entire time. I kept doing whatever I could to try and prompt him to talk to me, but he just wouldn't respond with much of anything. The ride home was just as awkward. I figured he simply didn't like me, and it was just a bad date. I was so relieved when he dropped me off back at my apartment. I figured I'd never see him again and chalk it off to one bad incident. However, no more than an hour later, he sent me an email telling me he had a good time and he wanted to see me again. I responded by simply saying I was flattered, but I didn't really feel we hit it off so much. I definitely didn't want to have to go through such an awkward experience again. When I got up in the morning, though, there were about 20 emails from that guy in my inbox. He kept on saying about what a fun time he'd had with me and that he wanted to spend time with me again. I just couldn't go through that silence again, though. I let him know I really wasn't interested and hoped that would be the end of it all. Almost immediately, he sent me an email back. I really didn't want to read it, but I figured I should. He was insisting I see him again. I didn't respond. After 5 minutes, he sent me another email complaining about why I hadn't responded yet. I was beginning to get a bit worried now. After a few minutes, there was another email demanding I respond right now. He said, "I know you're at your computer. I know you're reading my emails, so why are you not responding?" And that was when I decided the best thing to do was to block him, so I did so on everything. I thought that was going to be the end of it once again. I was off work that day because it was a weekend. I decided a few hours later to go get some lunch. As I walked out my front door, though, I was more than a little surprised and scared to see Todd's car waiting in the parking lot. I did my best to pretend like I hadn't noticed it and went to my own car. I got in and pulled out, and he immediately began following me. He wasn't even making an attempt to hide what he was doing. He was very blatantly stalking me. I was a bit scared now. Between his behavior on the date and the weird emails, I was sure he was going to try and do something. I made a lot of sharp turns trying to lose him, but he kept following me exactly. I'm not sure if you've ever had someone tail you in their car before, but it can be very, very frightening. At one point, still hoping I could lose him, I did get a bit ahead of him. Then I had a red light though. Maybe I should have run it, I don't know, but I just watched him in the rearview mirror. He wasn't attempting to stop at all. He was still going very fast. It was clear he was going to hit me. His car collided with mine at full speed and sent my car flying forward into the intersection. It scared the crap out of me. I was pressed back in my seat, and I actually thought I was going to die. A car that had the green light of the intersection was going in that moment, and it hit me dead on in the side, spinning me in the opposite direction. After spinning a few times, finally it was over. Even though Todd's car was badly damaged, he was able to drive away from the scene. The police came, and of course they eventually found and arrested him. He was charged with assault and hit and run. For the longest time, I had a problem driving. Every time I got into a car, I could still feel that accident happening and thinking I was going to die in that moment. Thank God I never saw him again. A lot of people who have either had good relationships or even those who've not been in relationships at all tend to think that Valentine's Day is just a really romantic holiday. I haven't seen it that way at all. I'm not bitter, mind you. It has more to do with the job I've worked for a long time. I've worked in a motel since I was 18 years old, and yeah, it was one of those types where people pay by the hour. It was sort of cool when I was 18 and just got the job. My friends all thought it was pretty neat I worked in a motel too. People were always hooking up all the time, and I did too. That faded the longer I worked there though. Of course, with a motel like that, you see a lot of hookers coming in and out. In the beginning, I was worried I would get into trouble for letting that happen. However, I soon got used to it. The day that I saw the most hookers in the motel was, of course, Valentine's Day. For me, when I think of Valentine's Day, I always think about two things: hookers and what happened to me a few years back on that day. I was working and I was the only one at the motel. It was quite busy, and there was this one woman named Tammy who frequented the area quite a lot. It wasn't unusual for her to have several stays in one day or evening. This day was no different. She knew me well and would often wink at me before she went to her room with her client. I guess during that day on Valentine's Day, Tammy had been there about 3 times or so. I don't really think about it too much more than that. Each time it was with a different guy, of course. They would be in the room for less than an hour, and I watched them leave each time. The third time, however, I only noticed the John leaving. He didn't return the key either. I thought maybe Tammy might have had it, or maybe he just left it in the room after the hour they paid for was up. As I waited and waited though, Tammy still had not come out yet. I gave about an extra 30 minutes, and still there was no signs of life from the room. I would have to go there and check it out myself. This wasn't a thing that happened very often, so I was a bit apprehensive. I took my master key and made my way over to the room. The curtains were all drawn shut. At this point, my mind was creating all sorts of bizarre scenarios that I was expecting to happen when I opened that door. When I finally opened it up, the room was completely dark. I switched on the light, expecting to see Tammy on the bed or the floor, but she wasn't in the room. I sighed in relief, assuming she'd just left without me seeing her. Then though, I noticed I heard water running. I remembered that I had to check the bathroom too. I walked over to the dark bathroom, opened the door, and flipped on the lights. There she was, beaten and bruised, laying face down in a bathtub full of water. Blood was all over the shower head and flowing down onto the floor. I checked really quick and was surprised to see that somehow she was still alive. I can't even explain how terrible she looked and can only imagine the beating he must have given her. I turned the water off right away and let her know I was going to call 911. Apparently, this John was a guy who'd been regularly beating up hookers in the area. Tammy was not the first of them, and I don't think she was the last either. He paid with cash and hardly anyone used his real name, so I doubt they were able to track down the guy in the end. So yeah, whenever I think about Valentine's Day, I think about hookers and violence. I was living in the Fiji Islands back in 2016, and I was 14 years old. This story happened to my family, but mainly my mom lived through it. It was on the 31st of October, and I was at school for a Halloween-based party. My parents and my little sister were gone to a family friend's Halloween party as well, so the house was completely empty. My party finished at 9 p.m. My dad came to pick me up, but dropped off my mom and sister at the house. because our security alarm was ringing. Because nobody was home, my family obviously called the security company over, and they sent a van with 3 security guards. My mom opened the house and let everyone in to check the entire thing. They didn't find anyone. My mother checked all the cupboards and under the bed with my little sister, who was only 12 at the time. The security went outside in the garden and into the basement as well to make sure that there was no one there and it was not an accidental ring. My mom turned all the lights on from the living room and the balcony. She had just started to open the window and the gates that protect all the windows to get on the balcony when she looked at the keyhole. She noticed there were some flip-flops on the floor nearby. She then looked a bit closer and saw 2 pairs of legs hiding close to each other against the wall under a garden sofa. My mom yelled out of her lungs. The 2 guys got scared and jumped off the balcony into the gardens. One of the guards responded quickly and grabbed one of the men. The second intruder ambushed the guard though, and they ran away together, jumping over the fence and running off into the forest. My mother regretted in that moment yelling. If she'd come down and talked to the security quietly, the guys probably would have been caught right then and there. My mother was now crying, holding my sister to her side and telling her everything would be okay. The security officers then called the police. They did a report and described the guys, and a search was started. The cops were there very quickly. The guys who jumped had lost a hat and their flip-flops and left their socks and 2 knives behind as well. Sadly, the men were never found again. But 2 weeks later, my mom pulled out of the driveway and looked into the rear-view mirror of her car. She was 90% sure the 2 guys standing there opposite our house were staring at her. The short one had the same kind of hat the robbers had left behind, and the other guy had a pair of brand new flip-flops. When my mom drove to the police station, the guys were long gone and never to be found again. My dad was mad that he didn't stay with my mom. I got home after that with my dad, to my mom and sister crying. My dad was mad he didn't stay, but my mom had drunk and could not drive. Luckily, my mom saw them before she opened the window, otherwise who knows what could have happened. Now, how did the 2 guys get onto the balcony in the first place? Well, it's going to sound stupid, but right next to the balcony where they were hiding, there were these 2 wooden poles linked to a weird plank thing. They weren't there for any specific purpose whatsoever. They were just kind of lying around. My dad had asked the landlord to get rid of them multiple times, but for whatever reason, the landlord refused to. So I guess that's how they managed to climb up onto the balcony. I'm now 21 and live in Australia, and even though I didn't live through this myself, it still really scared me. I always make sure to check the entirety of my house now, and make sure my house is always locked, to the point that sometimes I lock myself out of the house way too many times.